Tim is a WebKit engineer at Apple. And you might know him from features that he has implemented, or you might have used some of the features that Tim actually has implemented. Like who here uses the dialog element? Yes, dialog element. Dialog.show modal. I love that one. Popover. Popover. Yes. Tim also did the work on that. One that I really like. View transitions. The SPA version, SPAs, also known like we just saw yesterday, RFW, MPAs, also known as RFW, like real fucking websites, was the abbreviation. Like, this website, so you have a page, it has a link, you click it and it goes to the next page. Like, whoa, the web has been good at that for the past 30 years. And so Tim, they also did the work on view transitions in Safari. So if you have any feedback on all these things that I have mentioned, hit him up later. He's around. He's a friendly person. Ask him questions, give him feedback on this stuff. Tim has been around for quite some time as well. He first started doing contributions, by the way, to the Firefox user interface, and then eventually he made his way to Apple to work on WebKit. And today, well, question, who here ever has tried to style a form? And who here loved styling a form? 7 of you, that's not many. Tim will show us the way forward because Tim will be talking about form control styling. So please, Tim, take it away.
Apple is very well represented here. There was like a picture of Steve Jobs yesterday, and there was one just earlier this morning. Anyway, form control styling. It's a very interesting topic with a lot of interesting history, but also a very exciting future. But before I dive into the future, I want to show you what form control styling feels like today. So who here has completed the State of CSS survey? Not that many of you. Okay. Who here hates styling form controls? Okay, more of you. Great. So that lets me transition to the other slide. So why is everyone complaining about this? So let's look at a case study on checkboxes. So here I have some checkboxes from Nike's website. And if we look closely, they're not actually using input type checkbox. They're rebuilding the whole checkbox from scratch using button elements and div elements. And they also need to take care of accessibility. So anyway, my point here is not to be mean against Nike, but it's to say that form control styling is so annoying that big brands are willing to rebuild controls from scratch instead of customizing the built-in elements that HTML provide. So I actually built this framework for material design 11 years ago, and this was a project I did for fun before I joined Apple. And I want to show you my own experience with styling checkboxes. So I did one of the things every smart developer would do. I searched the web for advice. And this is the advice I was given. So you put an input followed by a label, and the label is actually empty. And then the label is linked back to the input using the for attribute, so that when you click the label, it will also toggle the checkbox. But then the advice is to apply display none onto the checkbox. So it's getting weird. And then you have like selectors like these to style the checkbox. And this means style the label next to my checkbox when my checkbox is checked. So this pattern avoids styling the input directly and puts all the styling burden on the label. So my label is actually my visual box for the checkbox. That's kind of insane. So this is not the current advice anymore for styling checkboxes, and thank God. But I remember thinking, this really, really sucks. But let's see why the internet recommended this. So here I have some checkboxes with no styling. So you basically get native checkboxes. And then here I try to apply background color light green, but nothing actually happens. Like my checkboxes are still native. So let's see how other things in CSS work. So one really important concept in CSS are user agent styles. And I like to think of user agent styles as like customer service. You know, you don't know what the outcome is going to be, and it tries to help you, but you don't know what the outcome is going to be like. So here I have some headings and a paragraph with no extra CSS, and they have different font sizes and font weights. So that's normal. You probably expect that. And this is your browser trying to help you by saying your headings are large and bold, and there's spacing between paragraphs. And this helps the user recognize and distinguish different types of content. So you can actually see those styles in the developer tools. And if you're in Firefox, If you're in Firefox, you need to fiddle around a bit in the settings if you want to see them. But anyway, if I apply some styling on the H1, it just layers on top, right? The purple background and the white text color are applied in addition to the larger text. But that's not what we saw with the checkboxes earlier. My light green background did not work. So form controls are really starting to feel like magic boxes. Now, I want to go back in time to describe why native form controls had so much importance. Now, Windows 95 was one of the first operating systems I've used. And personal computers just started being mainstream back then. Most people had to go to the library if they wanted to use computers. And when you taught someone how to use a computer, you had to teach them how to use a mouse. There was a lot of overhead around just learning how to use a computer. Now, on this old screenshot of Google on Internet Explorer, notice how the address bar in the browser and the search box on the website, they look the same. And the buttons on the scroll bars and the Google search buttons also matches. So good user experience back then was following patterns of the operating system. And in fact, all the buttons in the operating system look the same. And that way you could recognize what they were. And you could teach to someone that a 3D looking box was a button that you could click on using a mouse. And that text inputs were white boxes with gray borders that you could click on and type in using a keyboard. And some of these patterns are still a thing today. So here we have some text that's underlined. And most of you will think it's a link. And you can watch Chris's talk if you want to learn how to remove the underline. But anyway, browser makers wanted these patterns to stay familiar, and that's why you have form controls that are native by default. Now, if we go forward like a few years ahead, people got more familiar with computers, and CSS and technology in general got a lot more powerful, especially CSS. Yay. And brands really started to care about how to apply branding to their digital space, since they had more and more online users. Now, if I blur the previous slide, you'll probably recognize most of these logos. And brands want that same recognizability on their digital spaces. And in fact, it's crucial for some brands. So these are two different messaging apps from Meta with a very similar feature set, but you can distinguish them from each other using the colors of their digital space. Now, native form controls can be an obstacle for that, especially with the look and feel being like different across browsers and platforms. So native controls aren't really an ideal default anymore if you want to get fancy with like branding. And typography is also a very important part of branding. And in CSS, web fonts were created to make that more powerful on the web. So let's see how they work. Here I have a very, 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 very basic website layout with a sidebar and some content. And with sites like Google Fonts, web developers can just use a web font with 2 blocks of code. First, they import the style sheets for the font, and then they set the font family on the root element. And once you do that, the font changes, and it inherits all the way from the root element down to your headings and paragraphs. And to quote John yesterday, it flows like water, you know? But then here you notice that the text input hasn't changed. You know, they got stuck in the past. Like, water isn't flowing there. Like, it's like a beaver built a dam around the text input. And this is your browser trying to be helpful by saying, you know, form control should have a native font. And, you know, most of you have probably worked around this by reapplying the same font directly on the inputs. You can use font inherit if you don't want to repeat the font family, so that's a little trick. But would it be cool? Wouldn't it be cool if the browser just did this by default? Because this is just one more thing that makes form controls feel like magic boxes and different from the rest of CSS. But I'll come back to this later. Now, next I want to teach you about some concepts that you probably know about, but you can't really put a name on. So as you probably know, you can get non-native text inputs, and in fact, you know, you see them everywhere on the web, and thank God you can do this. You can apply a background color, and it will work on text inputs. But then you also get some Windows 95 style borders on the inputs. And this is what the standards call the primitive appearance. And there's a couple of properties that will get you into this primitive appearance. You have all the background properties and all the border properties. That means if you set like a filter or a margin, it won't actually like give you this appearance. You'll still get a native form control. But this doesn't work on all controls, however. So there are some controls where you need appearance none to get into this primitive appearance. And that's the case for checkboxes, radio buttons, and range inputs. And that's why setting a background color didn't do anything on our checkbox, because the checkbox still kept its native appearance. Now let's see what happens when you force the primitive appearance onto the checkbox using appearance none. Well, my box actually disappeared. I should be seeing a light green box or something. Like, my box just disappeared. Well, it's actually there. It just has a 0 by 0 size. So if you add the width and height, it shows the box again. But then initially, these boxes are not usable. Like, I can't see which one of these is actually checked or disabled. So I have to rebuild everything from scratch, including all the states. And this is the current advice for styling checkboxes. Imagine, you know, being new to CSS and having to deal with this. It feels really magical and error-prone. Like, I could easily forget to style a certain state, you know, and it can just make you feel lost if you lose the box when you apply appearance none, right? So anyway, to summarize, current defaults are very, very magical. The font family, the text color don't get passed into your text inputs. The checkboxes need to be recreated from scratch if they want to be styled. So at Apple, we've been thinking a lot about addressing these specific problems, and we developed this CSS form control styling specification, which is now a first public working draft. Now, most of the things I'm going to talk about next are a preview of the future. So you can't use them in any browser yet. So part of this draft includes appearance base, and it wipes away all the magic we saw earlier and lets you start from a consistent set of styles that would be the same in every browser. So let's see how that looks like. So here I have a form with some native form controls since I haven't styled them. And if I apply appearance base, I would get this styling. There's still a bit of discussion around it, but that's what you get now. And here's what happens if we add a gradient in the background of the page. The background of the form controls in appearance base is transparent. So you just see through the gradient. And this is a screenshot of appearance base across both color schemes. And you'll notice a few things. The text color matches the parent form by default. And the border color matches the text color for all controls. And by adding appearance base, I can simply style one of the parent elements, like the form, and the form controls would feel like part of my website really easily. So in this case, I've set a black background and a green text color, and I've added no extra styles on the controls themselves aside from appearance base. And this is what the end result would look like. And we've also fixed the font problem from earlier. Like I could just set a font family on the root element, and it would inherit all the way down to the form control. So to summarize, by default, the font family and the text color inherit. There's a transparent background, and this is exactly the same as styling a plain div. And this is, styling form control should just be as simple. It shouldn't be a magical box. So when trying to come up with the appearance base, the CSS working group wrote some design principles. And these are some ideals that the working group wants to achieve. And this makes sure we don't repeat mistakes from the native or primitive appearance, and also to make sure that appearance base is friendly for developers. So let's go through some of them. The styles are identical in every user agent. So this sounds like a very obvious one, but the native or the primitive appearance don't work the same in every browser. But they will work the same for appearance base. The controls are recognizable and usable on their own without additional styles. So some of what I said earlier about familiar patterns is still true. We still want users to recognize what a text input or a button is. And this is why there's like borders on form controls, for instance. Because if there's no borders, you wouldn't know where to click on the page to focus the form control. The controls pass 100% of accessibility standards. So developers should be able to trust built-in form controls, and getting accessibility right is a very important part of it, since you can easily get it wrong when you rebuild your own. The styles are consistent across controls in look and feel. So this means that if you put two form controls that have appearance base, they should feel like part of the same universe. The styles are consistent across controls in how they are defined in code. So this means we should use the same methods when we define the layout and styles of the controls by default. Like we shouldn't if we use padding on buttons, we should use padding on text inputs for the default style. So there's no surprise when styling one type of control versus another type of control. And the styles are easily adapted to the website's branding without needing complex reset style sheets. They use minimal code and are easy to override, so it's not painful for developers. They don't have a strong voice and tone of their own and are visually as simple as possible. So this means the design should be timeless because design trends keep changing endlessly. So we don't want to end up in a situation where the default style is a Windows 95 style input that you saw earlier. And last of all, they inherit page styles rather than define new styles whenever possible. So this is everything that I showed earlier about the font inheriting and the color inheriting into the text inputs. And all these principles play together to achieve the current appearance-based default design. So defaults are really, really important. They make up a bunch of the developer experience, especially if you're new to CSS. And since we have this chance to restart from scratch with appearance-based, it's important that we spend time getting them right. So now I want to look at something else that's magical that browsers have started addressing, which is form control sizing. So here we have a text area with 4 lines of text, but only 2 lines of our text area are shown when we display it. And here I have a div with 4 lines, and I put display 9 block, so it's a bit more similar to form controls. And I've also added a border so you can see the sizing of the div. And you can see that the div sizes to the contents of the text. You can see the full 4 lines. And there's actually a new way to size to content in CSS for form controls, and it's called field sizing content. And it's already shipping in Chrome, so you can try it out. And we just enabled it in Safari Technology Preview last week. So this is how you can try it out today. You just apply field sizing content to your form controls, and the size of the text area will adjust as I add and remove lines. So this is a pretty cool trick you can start using now if you want. I mean, Firefox doesn't support it, but anyway, we'd love for sizing to not be magical for appearance-based, and we're actually debating whether to put field sizing content by default. So I'd love for you to try out field sizing and your thoughts on how it feels and whether it would be a good default for you to work on top of. So who here has worked on the, who here is from the Chinese or Japanese or Korean market? Oh, okay, 1 person. So I don't know if the next slide will be very relevant, but one other thing that browsers have fixed recently is you can lay out form controls vertically for Chinese, Japanese, or Korean text, and that's actually new since 2024. It's very recent, and that's thanks to Interrupt 2023. So you could imagine getting like a bit more creative with online questionnaires or quizzes with it. So I hope that this really changes web design for the East Asian market. You know, I went to Japan recently. I've seen very awesome posters, and so I hope people will be able to do great things with this. Anyway, I've talked a lot about defaults and sizing, but what about these little bits and pieces inside the form control, like the button inside the file input or the little icons in the number input? So some browsers have a generated tree and let you target different parts through what we call pseudo elements. And most of these pseudo elements are non-standard and differ across browsers, and that makes them very, very painful for developers to use. Thankfully, there's parts that are already standardized and that you can use on your website, like the file selector button pseudo element. And another common part you probably know about is the placeholder inside text inputs. And this is also usable in all browsers. It's been like a couple of years now. Now let's talk about the future. In the future, appearance-based would opt you into new pseudo elements. So one of the pseudo elements is filled text, and it actually targets the area where you type the value. So here I've changed the background to yellow. And in the future, number inputs would get new pseudo elements, and field text is what I just shown earlier. And it's more relevant for number inputs than for text inputs, really. A step up and step down are the buttons to increase and decrease the value. And step control is a container around these two buttons. So I want to go through a small example on how to use those pseudo elements to achieve this result. I don't know if this is hot pink. No, I think this is magenta, actually. So first of all, you want to apply appearance base to get the new pseudo elements. And then we can remove the border from the inputs, which is awful now, but we can add it back onto filled text, and we get something like this. And then we can change the up and down arrow images to our liking using the step up and step down pseudo elements and the content property. And since by default appearance base uses flexbox to lay out the form controls, you can use the order CSS property to move the step control before the field text. I don't know if this is great for accessibility. Please double check. This is just an example for you to see how to use those pseudo elements. Next, I want to come back to checkboxes with a preview of how you would use them in the future. So you would get a checkmark pseudo element, and by default, the checkmark pseudo element has a Unicode character as content, and input type radio can also use this pseudo element. So let's go through a basic example. So first of all, you would apply appearance base to get the new default styles and the new pseudo elements. And I can change the border color to magenta or hot pink, whatever you want. And then the disabled state actually already works because appearance base sets opacity by default. That's something we might change, but that's how it currently is. But we can customize the check state. So here I've applied the magenta backgrounds, and I've applied the white text color. And we can actually set the text color here because our checkmark is a Unicode character. But if you don't like the Unicode character, you can change it by setting the content to a custom SVG, for instance, on the checkmark pseudo element. And as a final touch, we can add a small border radius. So it actually looks like a more realistic example. And that's our result. So notice how I didn't have to set any of the sizing related properties. I only set like styling related ones because appearance base would give me the width and height instead of making me start from nothing like appearance none would. So it feels a bit more like the rest of CSS. Next, I want to show you the future parts for the datetime inputs. So you have field component, which are the pseudo elements that represent the numerical components of your date and time. You have field separator, which is a separator between the components. And you have picker icon, which is the icon that you can click to open up the picker. So one thing to note right now is that you can't target a specific component because the ordering of the components depends on the current operating system's locale. So it might lead to unexpected problems to style like each component differently, which is why we decided not to allow that. Like imagine you decide to make the year larger and at the bottom, then you might screw up accidentally. So we haven't addressed the calendar picker yet because it's quite complex. There's many use cases. Some of the use cases involve adding like prices in like under the dates, and it requires extensions to HTML, so it's not quite CSS only. But anyway, I want to go through another example. So here we apply appearance base, which gives us access to the new pseudo element, and then I can style the picker, change it using the content property, set it to a custom SVG. And we can change the color of our separators as well. So here I've set the separators to be magenta. And we can also add a margin around the separators to make the date a bit more readable in real-world situations. So that's how we get this result. Now, the new customizable select that everyone is super excited about, and that's already in Chrome, and the Chrome team has done a lot of work standardizing this in HTML, so big up to them. So the new customizable select is also part of this world, because it also takes in the font family or the text color from your parent element if you use appearance base. And some of the new pseudo elements are shared, like checkmark or picker icon, for instance. And Bert has done a whole talk about this yesterday. So if you haven't seen it, you can watch it to learn more. And now I want to move on to show you the preview of the future of sliders. So you have slider track, which is a full track for the slider. You have slider fill, which is the progress part of the slider, and the slider sum, which is the part that you can drag around the slider. And we've also seen a lot of use cases like this, where you display the current value of the slider on top of the thumb inside a bubble. And currently, you need to use JavaScript if you want to reflect the value of the inputs. I've said the bad word, JavaScript. So we decided to introduce the control value function in our new spec to allow doing this without JavaScript. So let's see how we can reproduce this results. So first of all, to build our bubble, we want to add content after our range inputs. So we can use the after pseudo element to do that. And we can set the content to control value, which will reflect the current value of the slider. And we can also add a background color and a text color. Then, if I want to get the sizing right, I can set a width on the bubble. But to do that, I need to change the bubble to be inline block, because by default, the after pseudo element is inline element. And I'll also need to set the aspect ratio to 1 to make it a square instead of a rectangle. And this gets the sizing right, but then the text alignment is a bit weird. So to fix the text alignment, I can swap out inline block for inline grid, and I can use place content center, which is a nice shorthand for align content and justify content. And then you can apply border radius 100%, or 1 exponent 3, as I saw yesterday on Adam's talk. And now, so Wait, what slide am I on? Okay, so now that we have the bubble, but it's not actually anchored to the thumb. So if I want to display my bubble on top of the thumb, I can use anchor positioning, which should be widely available by the time control value is available. Fingers crossed. So to start, I need to use appearance base to get access to the pseudo elements. And the reason we need access to the new pseudo elements is because we need to set an anchor name on slider thumb. And once we have the anchor name on slider thumb, we can refer to that anchor name from position anchor on the bubble. And then we need to set anchor scope to thumb, because anchor name will do a document-wide lookup. So if you use multiple input type ranges on your page, it will all refer to the same element if you don't scope the names. So we need to set anchor scope to make sure this works when you put multiple range inputs. But this anchors my bubble to the thumb, but my bubble is actually overlapping the thumb. And to put the bubble above my thumb, I can just use position area top center, and that puts it on top. And that's how we get our result. So control value is not just for the CSS content property. It can also be put in like calc functions to generate lengths or angles. So hopefully people will get very creative with this. And hopefully you'll enjoy this extension. So this was a preview of some of the new stuff. And there's many, many different steps to ship a CSS feature. There's lots of drafting, debating, decisions, and prototyping. And these steps are not linear. A lot of these repeat. I had a much messier version of this slides, but I decided to only show a simple version because it was too messy. But anyway, this is where CSS Forms currently is in the process. So it's not currently in any browser, but that means you can be part of making this happen. And so I'd love to know if there's any use cases or pain points that we haven't thought about. So you can check out the spec. There's more in there that I haven't covered. And I got the great idea from previous speakers to add the QR code. That's great. And this is a link for issues if you want to file issues and request stuff. And here are my socials. I'll put them here for a bit. You can also just come up to me during CSS Day if you have any questions. I don't bite, I promise. And thank you for listening.